Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of the Tank Talk podcast. I am John Hudson from KG Tropicals and KeepFishKeeping.com, joined every week by my friend Jason Adams, the professor. Jason, we got a banger today. We got a good one.
I think we do. I believe we do. It's going to be a fun one. We've both got some stories to tell.
Some misery stories, some of which I have told in the past, not on this podcast, but on other avenues on YouTube and things like that. But we'll be able to go into them in much greater detail in this and stuff like that. You've got a couple of nightmare stories that you want to share, but the whole thing with this to me is, I know it might sound crazy, but I actually enjoy doing these kind of things. In the very beginning of my YouTube career, I was kind of scared of doing this kind of thing because I'm going to make myself look silly and people are going to think I'm a joke. But I've actually found over the years, 11 years now making content. What did I say? 11 years? No, 13 years making content on YouTube. I have found it quite therapeutic to say, hey, listen, I did something stupid and you, the listener or the viewer, can learn from that. Don't be dumb like me and don't make the same mistakes that I've made. And both of my stories that I have today are certainly things that were my fault. And so learn from my mistakes. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about something very important that you and I have coming up in the next couple of weeks. We will be going down to Aquashella in Dallas, Texas. And not only will we be going there to attend the best aquarium show on the planet, we're also going to be recording some podcasts down there.
We've got quite a few coming up, so that'll be exciting. In-person podcasts.
Yes. Not going to have the fancy aquariums behind us because we'll be in my hotel room or your, I don't know which one, but probably mine. And so that'll be interesting. We'll have a nice wall behind us or something like that. But I do think it's going to make a difference being there in person, face to face. And the other benefit that we're going to have is we're going to have some incredible guests that are going to be appearing on here. 3 of them are locked down already. I don't know if you have any more. But we've got, first of all, our good friend, a mutual friend of ours, Jay Wilson, is going to be on with us. And I spoke to him last weekend. He's not coming on just to talk CJ, even though he is the one of the main guys for CJ North America. We will touch on some of their amazing new products that are coming out. But also he wants to talk about the impact of social media on the aquarium hobby. And I'm all in on that.
For sure.
I don't know how you feel about it, but I think Jay Wilson is one of the best content creators on the internet when it comes to fish keeping content, whether it's Instagram, YouTube, it doesn't matter. That guy's a genius. So I'm looking forward to talking to him. Last time him and I met, it was in this room right here, and I ended up sending him to the emergency room. Not proud of it, but again, learn from my mistakes.
That's right. Get out of line. Sometimes, people have to go to the emergency room.
Got to show him who's boss. I mean, hey, listen. No, it was an accident, and it was a stupid accident because I did something stupid, and he paid the price for it. I felt horrible. He may show up wearing a helmet. I don't know, but
that would be special.
We have 2 more guests also that are going to be showing up. One of them is actually, both of these guys are people that have had massive impacts on this hobby. The first would be Rick Biro, who is the owner of Florida Exotic Fish Sales, one of my absolute favorite businesses on earth. This is the guy, him and his brother are pretty much single-handedly, or I guess that would be double-handedly because it was both of them, responsible for introducing the United States to African cichlids direct from Africa. They're not the very first people to ever bring African cichlids to the United States, but they're the first ones to really bring them in mass. They worked with Peter Davies and Stuart Grant and all of the big names that have fish named after them and stuff like that. If you're an African cichlid person, you see this tank behind me full of them. It's clear to say, and I think it's real to say, most of these fish wouldn't even be here if it weren't for what those two guys did. And some of the fish that are in there are actually their fish that they developed and named and created and stuff like that. So literally half of the fish that are in aquariums in the United States that are African cichlids, Rick named them. So, you know, that's pretty cool. He's going to have a huge story to tell, and that's going to be one of those podcasts that I'm just going to sit back with my hands behind my head and I'm just going to listen, because I love to listen to that man talk. Really excited about that one. And then another guy that I don't believe gets the credit that he deserves, him and his brother-in-law. I believe they deserve an immense level of credit for introducing this hobby to people that otherwise hadn't seen it. This is before the explosion of social media and all of that. This guy created a television show, which he starred in with his brother-in-law and their entire family, manufacturing custom aquariums for big high rollers and celebrities and things like that. And they sold that show to Animal Planet, and it became a very, very successful television show. Of course, I'm talking about Brett Raymer from the show Tanked, a guy that you and I have become friends with over the last couple of years. Great guy, and another awesome guy to just sit back and listen to.
It's going to be It's going to be an exciting lineup for sure. It's going to be awesome. I'm looking forward to talking to all three of them. And who knows, maybe we'll have a bonus one or two extras as we get through there, because you never know how it is at Aquashella. You start running into people, you start having conversations, and how many times have we had conversations and been like, man, I wish we had a camera rolling for that one. So.
Yep. And you know, when you're the two hosts of the most successful aquarium podcast on the whole planet, you know, we're going to have people lined up to coming to us and saying, hey, can I please be on there? No, I'm joking. But no, I mean, it is true. Like, Rick is super excited about it. He's sending me all of this information, and like, I want to make sure I do a good job and stuff like that. He's an old school guy. He doesn't want to put his face on something that he doesn't do right. So we may get others that want to do that too. And that's the place to do it, because so much of the industry is in Dallas, and the entire industry is going to be at the show. So, you know, it's going to be an opportunity to get some really big names in there. Maybe not even big names, maybe not even names that people know, but have had a big impact on this hobby. So I'm super, super excited about that. And I'm also excited about the fact that we'll be able to be sitting in the same room face to face, even if the majority of the episodes that we record are just me and you. I'm okay with that. Yeah. Because, you know, it's going to be a different deal when we're sitting there face to face. So really excited about that. That is coming up the 18th and 19th, correct?
Of May.
Which would be away. When this episode airs, it'll be next weekend that this is happening. But the episodes that we will be releasing from Aquashella will be obviously after that. So yeah, really looking forward to that. It's going to be very cool. I don't know about you, but we got the whole day blocked out for this. I'm wanting to get like 7 or 8 episodes recorded that day.
We're going to get 1,000 of them done.
Just all day, nonstop, just until we can't even talk anymore.
That's right.
All right. So anyway, thankfully I don't have to do a talk at this show. So
yeah, I'm not scheduled either. So it'll be good. I can destroy my voice before Aquashella even starts, I guess.
Yep. Lisa and I will have a booth there. We'll be selling stuff, and we'll have our plants and our merch and our everything. So we're not going to need a voice to do that. But anyway, really excited about all of that, and look forward to meeting all of y'all new fans of the Tank Talk podcast. Looking forward to meeting you all there. But today, got some nightmare stories, and I almost feel like maybe, because I've done so much talking, do you want to maybe tell one of your stories first?
I've got stories, man. I've got stories. So, and again, some of these stories that we have, maybe you've heard parts of them before in other formats on a live stream or something like that. But my first story. All right. For those of you who have been watching Primetime Aquatics for a while, you know that I don't actually maintain any of our aquariums. It's always been my 2 boys. They've been doing it since they were small. They do an awesome job. Well, there's going to be some lessons to be learned from this first story. My oldest son, he does his tanks on a Saturday, does a great job. We go out. So we went out, we went to dinner, and as we're coming home, we come home, I was still out. In fact, I think I might have been talking to you on the phone. And I don't know why, but Joanna and Eli went in the house, and all of a sudden, Eli comes back out and he's like, Dad, there's water running in the basement. I'm like, what? I'm like, whatever, just deal with it. He's like, no, Mommy says you better hurry up. And I'm like, this can't be good.
Uh-oh.
So I walk downstairs. I come downstairs. So basically, the gallery here used to be in an entire fish room. And so the stairs are, if you were watching this in video, they're right over here to my right. I walk down the stairs and I see water shooting out of our sink, like straight up in the air across the fish room. Joanna is soaking wet. She's like doing the whole thing. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen Mr. Mom and the two little water things in the dishwasher or the washing machine. They're going all over the place. And she's trying to get to the sink and turn the water off. She finally gets it off. She's soaking wet. There was probably in some places in our fish room in the basement, luckily this isn't a basement, at least 2 to 3 inches of standing water.
Oh.
And I'm looking at this. And at first I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I thought maybe the sink, like the actual plumbing of the sink broke, but luckily she was able to turn the water off. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, what happened here? There's a lot of water. Thankfully, all right, so lesson number 1 as we're going through this horror story, no power cords, no power strips on the floor. They were all up. So yeah, when you have a bad thing happen, such as what's happening here, and you just come running down and instinctually like water's going places, let me turn it off. And you just stepped in a couple inches of water, you got power strips on the floor. That could be a really bad day.
Could be the end of you.
To your day and all days after. So lesson number 1, we didn't have any power strips on the floor, no electricity. So she shuts it off. And now I'm like, the shock is starting to set in. Like, we've got a flood in our basement. So what had happened with this horrible series of events, for those of you who are running Python systems, right, the Python water changing systems, and you run it directly to your sink, and then you've got that little valve that you can change, and the water will go through the Python hose, and it could fill up your tank. You just hook the thing up. Well, we've got something very similar. It's a DIY thing, but it's the same concept where you turn a nozzle by the sink, and instead of the water going down into the sink, it goes into the hose to fill our tanks. And then we have another lever at where we hook on the water supply to the tank to turn it on and off. Well, those hoses, those Python hoses, are not meant long-term to hold the types of pressure that your water is going to be, your fresh water is going to be producing. So, I mean, it's a rubber hose. It's not copper piping. So what had happened was Luke, when he did his tanks, he forgot to shut the actual water off at the faucet in the sink. And so it was building up pressure because he had also closed the lever near the fill hose on side of the tank. So all that pressure was building up in that hose. And eventually, because the hose wasn't brand new, it split. And it split right by where it comes through the sink. And it was just spraying water all over the fish room. Now, it must have been doing that for almost, I would imagine, almost the entire time we were gone. Like, we must have left and come home, and it had been going for a couple of hours because the amount of water that was on the floor was, like I said, it was scary. I mean, if you think about just having an area flood, you're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Lesson number 2, all of these aquariums, they're in our fish room. The gallery's in a basement, the fish room's in a basement. So the flooring is tile, and under that is cement. So we're not worried about carpet getting all wet. We're not worried about destroying hardwood floors. So the floors in and of themselves were insignificant. Next thing, I've never actually shown this on our fish room side, but the walls, like the wood walls that you see, they actually don't go all the way to the floor. They stop about 3 inches from the bottom of the floor. So that was all dry. Now, what we did is, 1, we got the shop vac out. I called my sister-in-law, who was just a few houses down. She had like the shop vac. She had the Big Daddy. I had like the smaller one. I got Luke on the phone. I'm like, dude, we've got a 4-alarm emergency going here. I think you might have left the water on. I'm like, you got to get home. We got to get this done. He was home within 20 minutes. And so we had 2 shop vacs, a bunch of fans, a bunch of towels, some squeegees. The nice thing is, in our fish room, we have 2 sump pumps. So we have our
Nice.
main one, and then we have a backup that's in the other side of the fish room. And because it's a basement, all the floors are kind of, they're sloped so that eventually, if there's water, it would go into the sump pumps. Now that just gives you an idea though how much water was coming out of that sink, because we had a couple inches of standing water in the basement, even with those pumps, and they were running. They were running nonstop, but we were able to take a squeegee, get a lot of it off and into the floor drains. The shop vacs, I don't remember exactly how many. Like, the shop vacs are big, and we filled up at least a few of those, like pretty much full, to dump those things out in the sink. And I would say that horror story, that cleanup probably took, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 hours on I think it was a Saturday evening. I don't remember anymore, but I'm pretty sure it was a Saturday evening. And we had fans going and everything dried out, no mold or anything like that. But moral of the story is, if you've got those Python water changing systems, just double check your hoses, make sure you're shutting that stuff off, because those hoses are not meant to hold high pressure water.
Yeah, I had a very similar thing happen, except it wasn't that the water was left on, and it wasn't nearly as dramatic. But I had a similar thing where I hooked up my Python in my kitchen. This is not at this house. This was back in Virginia. We had two little 15-gallon tanks in our main family room, which has hardwood floors. I didn't like having them there because I wanted everything contained to one area, but Lisa wanted them there. So there you go. And I was doing water changes in there, and I turned the water on and had the Python closed, so that I could walk to the tanks, and the pressure built up. I put the hose in the tank, and then I did something else, and then when I went and grabbed it, boom, it popped, just like you were talking about. It got water everywhere, but I was immediately able to shut it off, and everything was okay. Just some towels cleaned everything up, but it's the same kind of a thing, like you said.
Yeah.
Those hoses, the Python system, in my opinion, is one of the biggest game changers in this hobby. And all credit to them. They made so many fish keepers' lives easier. They could charge $1,000 for that system, and I would tell you it's still worth it. However, it is not. We have two Pythons in this fish house now, going to two sinks. One's for dirty water, one's for clean water. And we don't ever close the valve on the handle. You just go to the sink and turn it on, and then when you're full, you turn it off, and it's for that reason. I don't want to have that happen again. So it's a great system, but you hit it on the head when you said they're not designed to really hold pressure. It's one thing if you're going from one tank to another and it's just a couple seconds, but if you're going to be leaving it, I wouldn't do it, because you might get your entire basement flooded. So. Yeah, that's scary. I also, in the saltwater tank behind me, had a bit of an overflow the other day. And I don't have any power strips on the floor, but the AC adapter for my protein skimmer was down there, and it wrecked it. It completely blew the AC adapter. So my very expensive protein skimmer is just sitting there dormant right now, not doing anything, because I got to track down a new AC adapter for it. So yeah, as much as we love water and trying to keep water clean, water is the enemy to a lot of things in our lives, for sure. I'm debating on which story to tell first here. I think I'm going to go with probably the most devastating story for my first nightmare story. Again, I've told these before. If you're somebody that's familiar with KG Tropicals, you may have heard this story before, but this one really wrecked my hobby and actually made me consider stepping away from it for a bit. We had our store for a few years, and then when we shut it down, we moved everything back to our house. I had a 150 gallon, one of the 30-inch tall, 6-foot 150s. I love that tank. It's one of my absolute favorite sizes, just because I love 30-inch tall tanks. I don't know how many it was. It was a lot of very mature African cichlids in this tank. And the interesting thing about it, and one of the things that made this such a devastating story, is the whole reason why Lisa and I started KG Tropicals was because we had peacocks breed. We were not trying to breed them. You don't really have to try to breed peacocks. They bred. It was a surprise thing. We decided to keep the fry. Those fry were very special to us. And I had like 8, I believe, full grown, like 7-inch long male peacocks that were from that batch. So I had them for like 8 years. They were very, very special. They all had names. We loved these fish very much. They were total mutts. They weren't like these gorgeous German reds or sunshine yellows or something. They were just beautiful mutts, but we loved them. They are involved in this story, which is horrible. But I had this 150 in the basement with a very large canister filter. Jason and I decided before starting recording here, we're not going to mention names. We did just talk about Python, but that's
it wasn't Python's fault.
No, right.
It wasn't designed to do that.
It's not the fault of the product. And in this case, it's not the fault of the product either. It's definitely mine. So, we're going to leave out brand names and stuff like that because there's no reason to make a company look bad for something that was 100% my fault. I did not realize that I had neglected to clean my canister filter. And it had been a bit. I don't know how long it was. But when you have a 150-gallon tank with probably over 50 large peacocks and haps, you're going to need to probably clean out that canister filter every 2 weeks. And I didn't. We had just gone through a lot. We had just moved. It was a lot going on. And the way I found out that I had neglected to clean this canister was a smell. I had a business where I was going to people's houses fixing furniture. I had a long day. I came home and I was in my living room and I was like, what is that? I said to Lisa, do you smell that? I asked the kids, do you smell that? They're like, yeah, it smells like dead fish. I said, oh no. So I went down into the basement and it's kind of hard to explain. My basement was about the size of yours, but it was a big horseshoe. So you go down, the stairs are in the middle of the basement. You go down and then you had to go all the way around to kind of the back end of this basement where the tank was in the corner. And as I'm walking down there, the smell is getting more and more and more intense. And that's when I saw it. That entire tank, with the exception of one fish, and I will tell you the species of fish that was, one fish survived. All of the others were gone. And we're talking all of those fish that we had bred and were very special to us. We had a Venustus named Vinny that was very special to us because we paid $25 for him. He was like 9 inches long when we bought him. We bought him because the people who were selling him said he's the devil. He kills anything you put with him. We proved him wrong. We put him in with ours and he was just fine. He never bothered anybody. It was an amazing tank. That tank was in the background of a lot of my videos like this one is now. And we lost them all with the exception of one. And the reason why was because I had not maintained that filter. And this particular filter, if you have one of these filters, if you don't maintain it and you have bangers in the tank like I did that are constantly producing waste and your sponges clog, it basically renders that filter completely useless. So much so that it basically just shuts down. And in a tank like that, which they really needed to be in a bigger tank, they went from a 240 to that one. And it wasn't even going to be permanent that they were in there. In that size tank with that many fish, that filter needed to be cleaned a lot. And I didn't because whatever reason, laziness, being preoccupied, having other things to do, whatever it is. And that filter basically shut down. And now anybody listening to this is probably thinking, well, geez, John, how neglectful were you if they were smelling like that? They must have been down there for days and days. No. When you have that many and they all die at once, and they're all big fish. It doesn't take long for that smell to happen. It had been less than 24 hours, and the smell wasn't like, our neighbors were calling the police because they smell something dead. It wasn't that bad, but it was definitely there. And if I had let it go another 4 or 5 hours, it probably would have been one of those things. We got to call the company to get this smell out of here. It was horrible. One of the most devastating things that I've ever experienced, because it was my fault. Excuse me. It was 100% my fault. And it was one of those things that when I saw all of those fish that were white floating at the top of the tank, not white, but you know what I mean? You can tell they're dead. They're all floating at the top of the tank. I knew exactly why that happened. I knew. I was like, I haven't cleaned that filter in probably a month. I know why that happened. This is happening, and it's my fault. And I'm not going to lie. As I was scooping them out, trying not to gag, I was a little teary-eyed because I knew I had done this. Obviously not intentionally, but I knew that it was my lack of action that resulted in that, and it was horrible. The one fish that did survive was a Tropheus duboisi, which was full grown, very big, a stunning fish. I pronounce it duboisi. I don't know how you pronounce it. I love that fish so much. The only thing I will tell anybody who's watching this that's considering buying those, they don't stay black with white polka dots for long. They're beautiful when they're babies, and they have those white polka dots, one of the most striking fish in the world. But when they grow, they basically become half black, half blue. They're awesome. I love them. Pale blue, almost white. Still a beautiful fish. That one fish did survive, and I had him another couple of years after that. But boys and girls, clean your filters, especially when you have big African cichlids in there. Otherwise, you may come home and you may find an entire tank full of dead fish.
Yeah, and it's devastating when that happens. There's no doubt about it, especially when you've got fish that long. I mean, it's brutal. So along those lines, I have a similar story here, and it's almost devastating. I didn't have the fish as long. One of the things that a lot of people probably wouldn't have to worry about when you are keeping fish is shooting a bunch of videos like you and I do. Well, I was on the fish room side of things, and the angle that I wanted, I have air lines hanging down our low boy in some of our tanks feeding air, because the other side is all sponge filters. So I had to turn those filters off, or I had to turn the valves off, and I undid the lines, and just so that I'm not standing behind a bunch of fish lines, because that would have looked really stupid. So I took those off temporarily, and those lines were feeding our 20-gallon tanks below the low boy. And I shot the video, I rehooked up the lines, I started editing, doing a bunch of stuff. That was in the evening. I come down the next morning, and I had those tanks at the time were breeding tanks. I had Neolamprologus caudopunctatus. It's an amazing fish. So the caudopuncs are these Lake Tanganyikan fish. They're rock dwellers. They only get a couple inches, kind of expensive. I had the orange tail variety, which were even more. They're really beautiful fish, more color, more desirable. I had a couple breeding tanks of those, heavily stocked. And so in those 20-gallon tanks, again, these are small fish. I might have had 50 in each one of these tanks, just in various stages of grow out. They're all dead. And I'm like, what just happened here? Well, in my genius move, when I unhooked all the filter lines, I did reattach them. I never turned the valves back on.
Oh.
So basically, the sponge filters that were in there were no longer running, and we no longer had gas exchange at the surface. And with that many fish, when you're stocking that many fish in an aquarium at the same time, you wind up with a big problem, and you wind up with that problem in a hurry. So with those sponge filters being gone, I lost pretty much all of them except for, I think, 6 or 7. And I was able to save those 6 or 7. I was able to reestablish that group. But it's still devastating when you've got a fish that you care about so much, and you've got a lot of them, and especially when you're breeding them, you got all the little babies and the juveniles, and everything was fine. You come down the next morning and you've lost pretty much everything. That really, really hurts. And the moral of the story there, and it kind of ties into what you're talking about with your tank, is when things go wrong in a heavily stocked tank, they're going to go wrong faster, right?
Hmm.
If that tank had been, and I've had it happen a million times, where you have maybe a sponge filter line come disconnected, or something gets shut off, or the thing, whatever, it gets clogged. If it's a lightly stocked tank, most likely things are going to be okay. Even for 24 hours, a lot of times it's like, well, there's still beneficial bacteria on the surface of that sponge filter inside of your aquarium. There's still, the ammonia spike may not happen. If it's lightly stocked, you're still going to get enough gas exchange. But in a tank that's heavily stocked, when filtration goes down, it's game over. And it happens as
Hmm.
soon as one fish starts to die, then the next one, then the next one, the next one. There's already not a lot of oxygen there, but now you've got fish that are dying, and it's sucking more of that oxygen out of the system, and it's just brutal. And so if you have heavily stocked tanks, maybe they're cichlid tanks like John's was with the peacocks, or Mbuna, or a lot of the other cichlid tanks, that African cichlid tanks where you heavily stock. We've got a female betta sorority where you're stocking it like crazy. Keep an eye on those filters. Make sure they're maintained. Make sure that you're, in the case of canister filters, that they're not clogging up. In the case of sponge filters, that the lines are free and clear, that your pumps, your air pumps that are supplying those filters are okay, because man, those things shut down, it is game over. You're going to lose fish, and you're going to lose them a lot faster than you think you will.
For sure. And that's kind of a perfect lead into a future topic that I know we already have on our list, which would be, I think it's one of your ideas, because so many of them were. I think you titled it like, when is enough, or when is it too much, or
Yeah.
something along those lines. That is one of the unfortunate things that can happen if you take this hobby too far, where, in my case back then, I had probably 60 tanks in that basement, because we were still running a business down there, and it was overwhelming. I had a full-time job, and I was doing this, and I was doing that, and I was doing YouTube, and it's easy to overlook things like that. And I can sit here and say, well, it was laziness, or in your case, just forgetfulness. You hooked up the line, but you forgot to turn on the valve. I mean, if you only had 3 or 4 tanks, the likelihood of you making that mistake pretty slim. And so, when does it become too much, I think is a great title for a topic that I'm sure you've got many more examples than that. And I've certainly got my share of, stories that probably wouldn't have happened had I not overextended myself.
Absolutely.
Yep. So I guess it's time to get into the bad one for me.
All right, lay it on us. Lay on the bad one.
It's probably not going to be as bad for somebody that's not me. But if you put yourself in my shoes, this is worst case scenario. This is DEFCON 5. This is like the biggest nightmare in the world. So we got to go all the way back to like 1995. I had like 5 aquariums, maybe 6. I don't recall. It was 6. It was definitely 6. And I had a silver arowana, which was my pride and joy. I had an Oscar in separate tanks, 29 gallons, because, I wanted to do this right. I think I talked about that in our introduction podcast. What a stupid mistake that was. But I didn't know any better back then. I was completely obsessed over arowanas. I mean, arowanas to me were like Harley Davidsons to you. I mean, it was just like I lived and breathed arowanas. This was my ex-wife. We had a small house, and we had an extra bedroom, and we had a friend that was kind of down on his luck at the time. We weren't heroes or anything like that. He was just in a situation where he needed somewhere to go. We rented him this room, our extra bedroom. And he was the best roommate ever, because he never left his room. He would get home from work, he would strip down to his underwear, and he would go in his room and watch wrestling tapes. And I'm not kidding you. I mean, that's what this guy did. WWF back then, and whatever, WCW or whatever they were back then, he had all of these things on tape, and he would just watch them because there was no cable in his room. He was an interesting guy. But he
The
was
only
one of my.
downside was he never shut his door, right? So you had to watch your roommate in his underwear watching wrestling.
Oh no, thankfully he closed his door, but
Okay.
him walking around in his boxer shorts was not an unusual thing. I mean, that's just what he did. Very unique guy. He did have enough respect to not walk around my ex-wife that way, but anyway, he was a really, really good dude. He was just an interesting guy. Well, he bought me the best birthday present anybody could have ever bought me at the time. It was a very expensive birthday present, while also not realizing he was making a gigantic mistake. He didn't know that he was making this mistake, and if I'm being honest with you, I didn't know he was making a mistake either. But it was so thoughtful because he knew how obsessed I was over arowanas. He went to the fish store, and it was one of those things where it's like, I'm going to find out something to buy John for his birthday. I'm going to walk in the door and I'm just going to buy something. It might be food, it might be whatever, but I'm going to buy him something from the fish store. And he saw in that store a black arowana. Now, if you're familiar with arowanas, so the Amazonian type arowanas, the arowanas that are labeled as black arowanas, they're kind of deceitful. Is that deceptive? Like the duboisii are, in that the way they look when they're babies is vastly different than the way they look when they grow up. They're pretty much all black when they're babies, but as they grow and mature and become big like silver arowanas do, they basically become a silver arowana with black trim around their fins. They don't stay all black. I didn't know that, and I had never seen one before. But he walked into this store, and there was a black arowana about 3 inches, just a baby, like just dropped its egg sac. I mean, it was like a brand new baby. $80 this fish cost. In 1995, this fish cost $80. And he bought me that fish for my birthday. I don't math on Wednesdays during podcasts. I don't know how old I was at the time, but I was born in 74 and this was 95. 21, that's pretty easy. My 21st birthday, a big deal. That must be why he spent big money on me. But he bought me this fish for my birthday, brought it in, gave it to me, and I've never been so overwhelmed. I mean, it was the equivalent of your parents giving you a nice brand new car on your birthday, on your 16th birthday, which I didn't get. But anyway, it was a magical moment for me. I was so excited. But then I had the dilemma of, well, where do I put this thing? What do I do with it? I've got 5 tanks, but this one's got piranhas. Can't do that. I've got a 16-inch silver arowana in this tank. Can't put them in there because it'll be food. I've got a Oscar tank. Again, the fish wouldn't last 20 seconds. So my only option was, this is so embarrassing. My only option was to put this fish in with a brood of baby, I'm afraid to say it, convict cichlids. These fish were, the babies, they were 5/8 of an inch long. They were babies. They were little things. They were still eating fry food. I mean, they were so small, but there was like a lot of them in there. I don't know how many there were. There were so many you couldn't count them. And so I'm like, well, there's no way in the world these little tiny fish can hurt this 3-inch arowana. He's the size of like 6 of these put together. They'll be fine. Put him in there. He was swimming around doing what arowanas do, going across the top, and it just looks so cute. I was in heaven. It was a beautiful thing. Stared at that fish for probably 2 hours, and then I finally went to bed. And then I woke up the next morning. And when I turned on the light, because I was excited, first thing I wanted to do was run down there and look at my black arowana. Turned on the light, and all that was left was the spine and skull of this black arowana. I had absolutely no idea that these fry would do that to that fish. I mean, arowanas, when they get some size to them, they can be fierce. I mean, they can defend themselves and they can do a really good job. But this was an infant arowana. It was just a little newborn and had stood no chance against those fry devils that they are. Horrible little fish. They devoured that thing. And I just remember sitting there thinking, first of all, I'm devastated because this fish is dead. But then I also thought, how am I going to tell him? He spent $80, and that $80 is now in the bellies of these stupid little convicts. I'm sorry if you're a convict lover, but it's one of the reasons why I hate them is because of this happening. I don't hate convicts, but I'll just never have them again. They breed too much, and when they do breed, they're really mean. But I was how am I going to do this? How am I going to tell him this? Because he spent all this money. It was so thoughtful what he did. And I can't believe I've done this. Fortunately for me, he was a really good dude, and he kind of laughed it off. I mean, and he took the approach, which was a very adult approach that he took, was like, hey, it's not like you did that on purpose. This was a mistake. It happens. It's unfortunate. I wish I didn't buy your convict cichlids all this fish food, but don't beat yourself up for it. It's all good. And I'm not buying you another one. I said, okay, I don't expect you to do that, but it was horrible. And I've never felt so guilty of anything involving fish keeping. It was just that feeling of dread standing there knowing I've got to tell him this. And, my ex-wife could care less. Like, she wasn't into fish. It was not, I don't even know if I ever even told her. I don't know. I mean, it wasn't really anything that would have mattered to her, but with him, I was so scared to tell him. But thankfully, he's a good guy, and he took it very well. I want to add a little thing to that story that has nothing to do with fish keeping, but this is such a creepy thing. It's so weird. If you were to talk to Lisa, she would tell you the exact same thing. Lisa and I we haven't done it in a while, but we used to, on random weekends, just go rent a bed and breakfast and basically get away from the kids for a weekend. Because we had 5 kids at the time, and they were all driving us crazy. So we would get a nice little weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast. We went to a bed and breakfast at a place called Bridgewater, Virginia, which was about 2 hours from our house. On the way to Bridgewater from King George, I told Lisa that story. And she was like, oh, that sucks. And she's like, does he still talk to you? And I said, well, I haven't seen, his name's Doug. I said, I haven't seen Doug in probably 20 years. I mean, I don't know. I can't do the math, but it had been a really long time since I'd seen him. And it wasn't because we were mad at each other. We didn't have a falling out. We just drifted apart. We became adults. And wouldn't you know it? And I'm telling you the honest to God story. Before we went to check in at that bed and breakfast, we stopped at a Walmart to buy food and drinks and all of this kind of stuff. And that guy, Doug, was at Walmart. He worked, I don't know if he worked for like Doritos or Frito-Lay or something. I don't know. But he was one of those guys that brought the product into Walmart and then was stocking the shelf. He wasn't a stocker at Walmart. He was actually a vendor for one of these brands. And he was stocking I think it was Doritos. And I walked up and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. Doug? And he was like, John. And we had a nice moment there. And I'm like, I was just telling my new lady, because Lisa and I had just started dating at that time. Not just started dating. We'd been together a couple of years. I'm like, I was just telling her about you and the arowana and all that. He's like, what? It was weird that I told her that story. And then within an hour, I ran into him 3 hours away from where him and I used to live. Bizarre that would have happened. Haven't seen him in 20 years, but there he was. Very weird how the world works sometimes. But yeah, that's my worst story for sure. And one that I will never forgive myself for, and one that I will never forget.
And the whole time you're telling this story, I'm imagining Doug. He's got his red boxer shorts on all the time. And you walk into Walmart, and there he is with his red boxer shorts on, just stocking Doritos in there and be like, John, how are you? Still wearing your boxer shorts, I see. Yep, but I've added this white V-neck dirty T-shirt as well.
Yeah, it was wintertime, so he was wearing a coat and all that. But Doug is if you saw him, you would be like, he's like a mountain man, like long hair, big beard, back before beards were cool. And
What I'm picturing.
yeah, he was a big burly man, but he was not walking around Walmart in his boxer shorts, and they were always red too, by the way. So I don't know how you figured that out, but yeah, that was a very eerie thing to run into him there. But yeah, good guy, very good birthday present. Don't buy a fish keeper fish as a birthday present unless it's your husband or your wife or your kids. You know where the fish is going. That's the lesson learned here. Worst mistake that you can make is to give somebody a fish and then that person has to say, this is great, but now what am I going to do with it? You don't want that, because you may run into a scenario. It's very thoughtful and it's very nice, but the better idea would be to give that friend a gift card or something, or say, hey, let me take you to the fish store, buy you whatever you want. That's a better way of doing it. Even though it's very thoughtful, it can be catastrophic to give them a gift like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is great advice.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, so we share these stories with you and share our pain so you don't have to feel it later, and maybe you've learned some things and you have some warnings in the back of your mind, like, hey, I better be careful when I'm filling tanks or disconnecting air hoses, or I've got canister filters, or I've got a friend who wants to buy me stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's fish keepers are hard to buy gifts for, that's for sure. But gift cards are never a bad thing. Now, listen, we're at like 45 minutes. We got time if you want to bring in.
I've got one more, and this one is probably my saddest. This is my sad one. So we'll end on a sad note. I mean, they are horror stories. You're not coming here. You did not come here and click on this podcast for an uplifting series of stories. Maybe someday we'll have an opposite to this, like the greatest things that have ever happened to us in fish keeping.
I would love that.
But that day is not today. So we're on this side of the fish room. Before it was a fish room, we had right behind me, if you're watching on YouTube, there was a big screen TV. We had the couch, if you remember. It was like a big U-shaped thing. And I had a couple of 55 gallons on either side of the widescreen TV. And on one of them, I had just moved in. Well, I had some, actually, they were in a 29 gallon. I had some yellow perch, and they were only about 3 inches long. So I had gotten these yellow perch. I think I had like maybe 4 of them or so. And I don't know if anyone has ever kept yellow perch before in an aquarium, but they are one of my all-time favorite fish, period. If you're looking for a large, peaceful fish that doesn't need a heater, yellow perch, and they tolerate one another really well. I found that out, and they were really easy to convert to just like prepared foods and stuff like flakes and pellets. They were problem free. So I'm looking at these yellow perch, and they're showing all the green and yellow and red color. They've got the black stripes. They look outstanding. I'm like, I got to get these guys a bigger tank. They're going to grow. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to set up a 55 gallon. So I set up a 55 knowing that was not going to be the end goal. I knew I had some 125s going in on the other side of the fish room at some point. So I threw these fish in a 55 gallon. I think I might have had like one pumpkin seed in there, a smaller one, and possibly a catfish. So I throw them in there. I'm super excited. They're looking great. You know how you first fill up a tank and they're just popping full of color and the water looks great. And I filled that thing up. I went upstairs for a few hours, and I came back down to see how they were doing, feed the fish before I go to bed. They're all dead. Every last one of them in that tank, gone. You don't understand. I had basically nurtured these little yellow perch from, kind of like you did with the peacock cichlids, from a very small size. And I was finally getting them into a bigger tank to watch them grow, and they were just so enjoyable to watch. And I'm like, wow, they're all gone. And clue number one is all of their gills were really inflamed and they were stuck open. And usually when you have a fish where their mouth is stuck open and their gills are stuck open and they're inflamed, that tells you something was wrong with gas exchange in their gills. And then I realized it's a mistake I bet many of us have made. And I've made this mistake more than once. I put no dechlorinator in that tank. I completely forgot. So I filled the tank, the fish went in, forgot to dechlorinate it, and I basically wiped them all out. So it was horrible. And you would think I would learn my lesson from that. I didn't, because I did the exact same thing on the Lake Tanganyika in 75 in the gallery. This was just what, 3 months ago? Whenever we set up that tank, you can go back and look at the video. I did the exact same thing. I
Wow.
filled up the tank, and this, in my defense on this one, not that there is a defense on this, but I'm getting ready. I'm trying to film it. I'm filming the aquascape. I'm filming, hey, let's add the fish. I'm filming the tank filling up. And so I'm doing all this filming, and it was just in all of that, I forgot to put the dechlorinator in. But this wasn't like a bunch of fish just died right away. Next morning I come down, and it was just mostly the Cyprichromis, which unfortunately was the most expensive fish I put in that aquarium. And my rock dwellers, my ornatus rock dwellers, which are really pretty. They're yellow and black stripes. The Cyprichromis are pretty expensive fish. They blue with really pretty yellow tails. They were all dead, all of them. And I'm like,
Wow.
what the heck happened? Most of my shell dwellers were okay, but they weren't acting right. So I'm scooping out these dead fish like every couple of hours. I'm like, what is going on? And why is it just a Cyprichromis? I'm starting to think, was the Similis carrying a disease? And that, I'm like, there's no way they would have died that fast. They wouldn't have spread disease that fast. And then I realized once again, oh my gosh, I didn't dechlorinate that tank. The dechlorinator was still on the other side of the fish room. It wasn't over here, which means I didn't touch it.
Wow.
And somehow the Cyprichromis are really sensitive to water parameters. The Julidochromis ornatus were really sensitive, but those little Similis shell dwellers, they were hanging tough. And I eventually did a massive water change because I had a bunch of dead fish and dechlorinated it this time. And if you look at the last fish room gallery tour that I did, the Similis survived. A couple of the Cyprichromis survived. One of the ornatus survived. And I've since added a bunch of fish in there. So the tank is fine, but it is a mistake that can absolutely happen. People ask all the time, when should I add the dechlorinator? Should I add it before or during or after? We usually just add it right before. So after we drain a tank, we'll dump in our dechlorinator and then fill. But man, you forget that stuff and things can go wrong in a hurry.
We had a similar scenario, but it was not. It's also a nightmare story, but it wasn't anything to do with the chlorinator. And I don't think it'll make you feel better, but I guess you would have noticed if this was an issue, and you could blame your issue on that. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is we had, Lisa did a big water change, like a 50% water change in her 125 gallon discus tank. We all know discus are the most fragile fish ever, right? She did this water change completely normally, like she normally would. Unplugged the filter, did all of that, plugged it back in. Everything's back up and running after the water change. Everything's great. She put her dechlorinator in it. We use Fritz Complete, which is, I'm sure, what you use too. And everything's perfectly fine. We go in. I don't know what we were doing. We were messing around in the house. We go back out there an hour later. This tank had 12, I think, discus in it, and like 24 rummy nose tetras that were like 1.5 inches long. And what do you think, if there was a problem with either of those fish, which one would you kind of naturally believe was the one that would have had the problem?
You would think the discus, because they're so sensitive to water parameters and ammonia and heavy metals
Right.
and all that stuff.
Discus were perfectly fine, but every single one of those rummy nose tetras was stuck to the intake of the filter.
Man.
And it's like, what in the heck? And we found out later on that our water supplier had done a huge flush and all of this, and we didn't know that. And, it's not like they went and knocked on everybody's door. Hey, guess what? We're doing this. They usually send letters out, or like in our case, our water company will email us now and tell us, hey, we're getting ready to do this. So beware, your water might smell like chlorine. In fact, Lisa's come to me a couple times down here and said, hey, don't do any water changes this week because they're doing the thing with the thing. So, but we didn't have any kind of notice like that there, and every single one of those rummy nose died. So even if you do add your chlorinator, sometimes you can run into something that's completely out of your control, and the worst still could happen. I guess the story would be way worse if all of the discus died too. And if I'm being honest, I was surprised that nothing happened to the discus. I mean, rummy nose are usually pretty hardy fish, but certainly more hardy than discus are. But yeah, they all perished in that, and that was very, very sad. What are you going to do?
The exact same thing happened. We had it, same thing where there was something in the water. The boys did a big water change. But here's the crazy thing. They did most of the aquariums, but only certain aquariums were impacted. So we lost half of our bristlenose and our bristlenose breeding tank. We lost our ballast sharks, our tinfoil barbs in a completely separate tank. And then Joanna lost half of her bettas on her side. We did all the water changes. All the other tanks were 100% fine. All the other fish in the other tanks were fine. It was just, it impacted those fish the most. Kind of makes sense. I mean, you got a heavily stocked bristlenose tank, and then you've got tinfoil barbs and ballast sharks, which require a lot of gas exchange. They're high energy. The bettas were the one that really surprised me, because you would think that those, if anything's going to survive, like, all right, well, air breathers, we can
Right.
survive it. But yeah, it was just impacted bettas, tinfoil barb, ballast shark, bristlenose. Everything else was fine. It was crazy.
Wow. Yeah, it's one of those things you can't see it coming, and you would expect when something like that goes on, if it's that severe, you would expect to be able to smell the chlorine in the water. Because I've had that before, where you go to brush your teeth and you're like, wow, it smells like the rec center in here. What's going on? And you smell that, but not that day. We didn't smell anything out of the ordinary. And I'm sure you do this the same way we do. We refill our tanks with the hose and we dechlorinate while we're filling it up. A lot of people think that's risky to do. I don't agree. I think it's perfectly fine. I've been doing it that way for decades. And we didn't do anything differently, or she didn't do anything differently that day than anything else. And it just happened. It is what it is.
Yeah.
Nothing you can do to, I mean, I suppose you could know it's coming if they do send out a notification and you still do a water change anyway. Well, you took that risk and now you get what you get. But, in her case, we didn't have any kind of notification like that. She did what she normally does. Boom, it happened. And that's one of the things that really sucks about this hobby. It's really bad when it's your fault. When you forget to clean out the filter, or you put fish with the wrong fish, or you forget to turn on the air valves, that's horrible. But when it's beyond your control, I don't know if that's worse or better, because
it's definitely more frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not one of those people that's like, well, it's not my fault, so it doesn't bother me as much. No, it still bothers me.
Yeah.
What could I have done to not do that? But sometimes things happen that there's nothing you can do about it.
That's exactly true.
So there we are. That's, unless you have any more, I think we've done enough depressing our audience for this day.
Yeah. We promise that the next few episodes will not be depressing, or at least we hope they won't be depressing.
Yeah, you're going to be talking about sponge filters in the next week's episode. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is true.
That'll be exciting. So everybody's favorite aquarium filter, we'll be spending a whole bunch of time talking about that. So be looking forward to that. I'm excited about it. Again, excited about Aquashella coming up. If you're thinking about going there, definitely do. If you're within driving distance, and you'll have a lot of fun there. We look forward to seeing everybody out there, and I know I can speak very confidently for Jason here. We look forward to seeing you again next week, and we definitely appreciate all of the support that we've gotten on this podcast. It's an amazing thing. We feel like, whether it actually is or not, we feel like it's the #1 aquarium podcast on the internet. So thank you for letting us feel that way. Thank you for hanging out with us for the last hour and listening to our misery. And we will see you next week.
See you next week.